Brexit has been the great unmentionable so far in this election. But tonight, Keir Starmer calls for closer ties with the EU. We'll digest that. And what can the party's social media campaigns tell us about the state of the race? Good evening. Welcome to Newsnight, home to analysis and interviews. Who would have imagined at the last election that the towering presence of Brexit would hardly register as an issue halfway through the next election campaign? It's not gone away as an issue, it just seems to have been parked by all the main parties for now. But tonight, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, whose Ming Vase strategy started by saying as little as possible about Britain's exit from the European Union, has, under the BBC's questioning, given the fullest account of how a possible Labour government would approach this thorny issue. We'll be exploring that with the head of Labour's pro-European bloc and the Conservatives' new approach to the election, leaning into devastating polls about them with our panel, Kirsty Buchanan, a former advisor to Theresa May, and Rachel Cunliffe, Associate Political Editor of The New Statesman. Plus, a big announcement from the Palace, a knighthood for the Post Office campaigner Alan Bates. But first, here's Nick with the very latest.
Yes, well, it's interesting you're saying, Faisal, that Keir Starmer wants to have a closer relationship with the EU. He clearly wants to do that. I mean, you just have to look at his manifesto. He discusses the EU in a section called Britain Reconnected, i.e. we're not connected as we are now. And there's a picture of Keir Starmer with David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, outside the Bundestag. Now, I cannot imagine any Conservative leader allowing that sort of a picture to appear, really, since John Major, when he took over the leadership in 1990, he said the UK's at the heart of Europe, and where did he go? He went to see Helmut Kohl, the then Chancellor of Germany. So just to get an idea of how Keir Starmer envisages our relationship with the EU if he becomes Prime Minister, let's listen to this exchange this evening with Nick Robinson.
We've left and we're not going back into membership of the EU.
You're not that keen on growth.
The single market, the
No, but you're not
customs
that
union.
keen on growth, then.
Well, two or three things about that, Nick. The first is, I do think we can do better than the botched deal that we got under Boris Johnson. I think every business thinks that. So if there are businesses that are watching this, yes, I hear what you say about the barriers to trade, and we are going to do something about that. But the second thing, and I think this is important, is if you look at the problems for growth over the last 14 years, they were there, or many of them were there, before Brexit. So the idea that the sort of single silver bullet is simply the relationship with the EU is not something I accept.
So closer but carefully calibrated, so not rejoining, not entering the economic architecture like the single market, because that would mean free movement, absolute red line, not going to have that, but improving what he describes as Boris Johnson's botched deal. As a first step, having a veterinary agreement with the EU, which would soften border controls. It would make the Northern Ireland GBNI checks much easier. There would be some involvement of the European Court of Justice, but he's much more relaxed about that. And then he talks about tearing down unnecessary barriers to trade. So if, as Keir Starmer says, your primary goal is to have growth, economic growth, you probably need a closer relationship with your nearest trading partners. And John Curtis, the great pollster, says that if Keir Starmer does win and wins well, around about 75% of his electoral coalition would have a pro-European perspective. But cautious, because the EU Brexit up until now for Keir Starmer has been kryptonite, because it was one of the big factors, him wanting to reverse Brexit around the time of the last election. Kryptonite, one of the big issues that led to that big Labour defeat, is his view.
There's sort of nods to businesses here that they're likely to come up with a wish list, but maybe not before the election. What did you make of that, Rachel?
I don't think it told us anything that we hadn't had the signs for watching Labour over the past year. David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, has been clear that his guiding philosophy is what he calls progressive realism, dealing with the world as it is rather than as you wish it were. And the reality is Britain left the EU, that decision has been made, but that the relationships that we have with European partners, particularly the French and Germans, have been really damaged by the last couple of years of Conservative government, and that there are ways that Labour can rebuild those ties, move closer together without rejoining the European Union.
So, Kirsty, I mean, you were sort of combatant in the Brexit wars all those years ago as Theresa May.
Scars on my back.
Yes. Do you, and would you be surprised by how little it's been mentioned in the next election, given what you went through all those years ago?
I'm not. Look, it doesn't benefit either party at the moment to talk about Brexit, so I'm surprised that actually he's gone as far as he has in that interview. What is fascinating for me about this is obviously he's ruling out in that interview going back into a single market. And the common customs union. Sorry, thank you. But the issue there is for this term. Now, everything that Keir Starmer is talking about is predicated on growth, and growth that requires huge transformational change, regulatory reform, planning reform, infrastructure reform. None of these things come quickly. They all take years and years and years. So when you've got a large Labour government, the chances that that growth doesn't come as quickly as anyone would hope, the pressure will start to come back on him to say, actually, you really want growth? The easiest way to get it for Britain is to go back in to the common market, go back in with our European partners. They're our biggest trading partner. So interestingly for Labour, this is a 10-year project for Starmer, reform and renewal. Not this term, but let's see what happens in terms of pressure about what they say going into a second term.
It's fascinating to imagine what they may have thought about what Theresa May was offered, but we'll get to that later. We're going to talk to Stella Creasy, who's standing for Labour in the elections, but is also the national chair of the Labour Movement for Europe. Thanks for joining us, Stella. I mean, listening to this election campaign so far, you'd think that sort of Brexit didn't matter. Everyone's trying to avoid talking about it.
It's interesting, though. Genuinely, I talk to candidates across the country. We've got 55 of them who are standing endorsed by the Labour Movement for Europe, and also existing candidates who are re-standing, and MPs like myself who are part of it. And it is actually starting to come up on the doorstep. But it's coming up because of the everyday problems it's causing. Businesses who find they just can no longer trade with our nearest neighbours, people who are finding troubles travelling, some of the problems created by the visa scheme, all the paperwork that people are having to deal with, and the recognition that it's leading to problems in our food supply chain. So it is starting to come through as an issue on its own. Absolutely nowhere near as big as concerns about the cost of living or housing or indeed international affairs. But I have actually been surprised, if I'm honest myself, at how much people are starting to put the dots together to see the damage that Brexit has done to us.
Well, obviously that's from your perspective, but intriguing form of words from your leader tonight to businesses. It was this bit that sparked me a little bit. I hear what you're saying about barriers to trade and we'll do something about it, which seems a little bit more than what was in the manifesto.
Yeah, and look, I think it's good because I thought actually what Keir said was right. We've got long-standing problems in the UK economy, and in those challenges, Brexit has disproportionately compounded them. Because frankly, there are many things that you can fight in life, but geography isn't one of them. So your ability to trade with your neighbours is absolutely crucial to your economy. And businesses have been saying, because one of the things I think people don't realise is, look, the trade and cooperation agreement was a bad deal. That's why some of us didn't support it at all. But what this government has done since has actually compounded some of the barriers that people are facing. You know, talk to those food importers tearing their hair out at the Brexit border tax, all the charges they now face for importing food into this country that are entirely of this current Conservative government's making. So I'm not surprised that Keir is recognising that businesses are saying, actually, look, this isn't about going back to 2016 or 2019 and having the same old tired arguments. This is about what is happening now, the margins that are being cut into that make, frankly, a lot of these businesses say it's not worth it. And I am really genuinely worried about what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks when all those invoices drop for those charges.
So you make the case against the new barriers, particularly in food. I mean, others might argue that in advanced manufacturing, it hasn't been as bad as some might have suspected in car industry and the like. But you talked about geography being important here, but democracy is important.
GDP has fallen 4 to 5%. I mean, that's quite big.
Well, that's over 15 years. Let's not get into that. That's over 15 years, so that hasn't happened yet, actually, according to the OBR. But let's talk about democracy. So Angela Rayner was very clear last night that Labour would never rejoin the EU or the single market. So Labour is now, your party is now a pro-Brexit party. It's a party of Brexit.
Look, I sit here as the chair of the Labour Movement for Europe. I recognise actually we might not even know what the single market looks like. After all, Europe is currently conducting a review of the single market because they say it doesn't quite work for them, the letter review. So I think we have to park what we can see in front of us now and ask what we can do now, because actually what I'm really focused on is all the British jobs and businesses that don't have time for treaty renegotiation or lengthy discussions. That's why I'm a particular fan, and we're championing in the Labour Movement for Europe, the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention, which is basically a series of queries about rules of origin. You're talking about manufacturing, Faisal. That would make a big difference to those creating goods and trying to import and export them in the UK if we could be part of that. And that is something we could negotiate pretty quickly, and I think is part of that conversation about, look, OK, we voted to leave the European Union. That's a decision that the British public have made. But did they vote for the problems that have come with that? Or are there things that we can do within the confines of that vote that actually would make a tangible difference to people's lives? And I would argue reducing all that paperwork and all those trade barriers really could. And that's what we're focused on in the Labour Movement for
I didn't
Europe.
think we'd be talking about accumulation on Newsnight, but like maybe something a little bit more easy to understand.
Somebody has to, Faisal.
is the youth mobility scheme. Now, a month ago, perhaps unexpectedly, the EU offered that. Maybe that was timed ahead of a potential election. The Tories said no. Labour said flat out no. How do you explain that to your younger voters, the same voters you're trying to target with votes at 16?
I've been very clear. I don't think we should rule out looking at what is being put forward, and I think what was put forward wouldn't work for this country. But I'm a great proponent of let's start talking to Europe, but also recognising and respecting the fact that they're still making time for us. You know, in any of these conversations, Faisal, we cannot underplay just how damaged our relationship with Europe has been by Brexit and the subsequent behaviour of Conservative Prime Ministers like Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. She went to Europe and said she wasn't sure whether the French were friend or foe.
Yes.
So whenever people are coming forward with proposals, and bear in mind the youth mobility proposal came forward because the Conservative government was trying to negotiate a youth mobility scheme, I think we should at least say, look, let's see what you're talking about. This doesn't work, but let's be open-minded about what could come forward, what might benefit British consumers and British businesses. Because actually, if you look at the polling, 70% of the public think a youth mobility scheme is a good idea.
We must leave that there. I think the Prime Minister might argue that he did do a decent negotiation with the European Union on the Windsor Framework, for example. But we must leave that there now. Stella Creasy, thank you very much for joining us there. Now, put some of that to you, Kirsty. There's another side, obviously, this argument and the reform surge. In the polls at least, and then a new argument we're hearing too, where many of the parties are just sort of suggesting the election's done and dusted, and even now the Conservatives are joining in with that.
Yeah, so bear in mind that normally those kind of, vote reform, get Labour, vote reform, get Keir Starmer messages, normally you wouldn't hear till the tail end, the week before. But bear in mind that next week the postal votes start to come out, which is why we're seeing this argument now. The polls haven't shifted. We've had the leaders' debates. We've had the manifestos out. We've had a series of catastrophic own goals by the Conservatives. The Conservative vote is cratering. It's less than half of what it was in 2019, to put it in perspective, even though the public aren't sold on Keir Starmer and aren't sold on the Labour project at all. So actually what they're being reduced to is saying, look, actually, even if 6 million plus people vote for reform, because of our first past the post system, you might get one, possibly two MPs, but they are not the opposition to Labour. And all you're going to end up with is what they're starting to call a supermajority, to play into this fear of a sort of unchecked Labour power and to play into this. There's cynicism with the public about Labour. They're not sold on it. And so actually it's a negative campaign. Yeah. And to counter that, you've got Labour saying, if you want change, vote for change.
Is it not sort of capitulation on the part of the parties that have started deploying this argument?
I think Kathy's absolutely right. The fact that they've started this argument so soon in an election campaign is a sign of desperation. Similarly, the line that you're getting from the Conservatives a lot at the moment is vote for us because you don't want to hand Keir Starmer a blank cheque, and this fear-mongering about a supermajority. A large landslide majority in British politics doesn't really make any difference. We don't have supermajorities in the way that other countries do, so it's a pretty meaningless threat. But I think the reform surge is interesting from a Conservative perspective, but all this talk about reform potentially being the opposition now, it's worth remembering that the second largest party, if the Conservative support does crater in the way that we're seeing, could well be the Liberal Democrats. They could end up with around the same number of seats as the Conservatives. Reform will, as Kirsty said, get 1, possibly 2 seats. They're not serious in being the opposition in that way. What they're serious about is trying to move the argument, move the Conservative Party.
I mean, it's interesting, both Kirsty and Rachel using the language about the Conservative vote cratering. George Osborne has been talking about this very issue in his podcast, and he's been saying that it is a completely logical thing for the Conservative Party to be warning of a supermajority. And he said it's exactly what they did in 2005 under Michael Howard. It was very obvious Tony Blair was going to get a third election victory, so their strategy was cut him down to size. But the point is, they were doing that from opposition and having been in opposition for some time. This is the Conservative cabinet doing it from government, and this is not how they started their campaign. How they started their campaign is, we're going to expose the weakness of Labour's position, and under the relentless focus of our campaign, Keir Starmer will crumble within a few weeks, and that clearly hasn't been happening.
But that was before the Farage factor, and one of the big arguments about going early for New Labour, for number 10, was about wrong-footing reform. And at first it looked like it was working, but of course the minute that Farage entered the race, what we've seen is an uptick, a relatively small uptick in reforms vote, but that translates really badly into seats, because obviously the Conservatives have a disproportionate amount of marginal seats that they're trying to defend. So we do, Stonehaven, where I work, we conduct weekly MRP polls at the moment, and we've seen reforms vote uptick to about 13, almost 14. But actually what that's done to the Tory vote is pushed it down 54 seats.
Just really quickly, you were a veteran, obviously, 2017, where we did see a massive shift in the polls against your person in that case. 15% it moved, didn't it? I mean, is there any chance that can happen?
It's Labour's to lose. Right. What happened, it's the same sort of scenario in as much as Theresa May's support was broad, but it was shallow across the base. So one really catastrophic error, and it drained really quickly. Unless Starmer makes a wrong-footed move, and so far he's been very sure-footed. I don't see it happening.
OK. Speak with experience there. Now, shortly before Labour launched its manifesto in Manchester yesterday, Plaid Cymru, unveiled their election document in Cardiff. And I'm joined now down the line from Cardiff by Plaid's deputy leader, the member of the Welsh Senedd, Delith Jewell. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, good evening.
You launched your manifesto, and we've just been talking about Brexit. You've got something to say about that in terms of the single market. Your manifesto says it's a failure. And so were the Welsh people wrong about that?
Well, good evening. Thank you very much for having me with you this evening. We, in our manifesto, are saying that Wales should be able to demand more than we are getting at the moment. We're halfway through this election, and if it weren't for Plaid Cymru, I doubt Wales would even get a mention in the campaign. Now, when it comes to Brexit, like so many policies, we are putting forward ambitious, progressive policies to help our communities. And where is the conviction from the Labour Party? Where is the courage from the Labour Party? They seem to be chasing what they think public opinion might be rather than trying to lead. And it is clear that if people want a strong voice for Wales's values, for Wales's communities in Westminster, Plaid Cymru MPs will be the only sure way that Wales's corner will get fought.
But the last time it was at the ballot box, an independent Wales, if there would have voted for Brexit. I mean, more than Scotland and Northern Ireland.
So in terms of
the Brexit vote.
Could you repeat that, please?
Sorry, I mean, Wales voted for Brexit, didn't it? And so an independent one would have also left the European Union.
Well, in terms of the opinion polls, I think the successive opinion polls have shown that opinion has shifted, and Brexit is doing untold harm to our communities in terms of red tape faced by businesses, in terms of the extra costs that people are facing. And I think that it shows a lack of conviction and courage from the parties, that they're not willing to face up to that reality. Plaid Cymru is fighting to make sure that our economy actually benefits from rejoining the single market and the customs union. It is patently clear that that is what needs to happen for our economy. I just wish the Labour Party would catch up and would stop trying to second chance or second guess what they think people want them to be saying. They should be leading from the front rather than just chasing what they think public opinion might be.
But you're another non-Labour party that's deploying this argument that Labour are going to win, therefore maybe you should you can vote for us. I mean, it seems like something of a capitulation.
Well, I don't think it's capitulation at all. I mean, clearly, in the first past the post system that we have, which is a deeply flawed system, we know already who is going to be in number 10. But in terms of what people are going to be voting for on the 4th of July, they are voting for who their local champion will be, who their local voice will be in Westminster. Having worked for Plaid Cymru MPs myself in Westminster, I can attest to the fact that it will be Plaid Cymru MPs who will fight Wales's corner, who will not just vote how the whip tells them to do to suit the benefits of London.
But are you giving up even on the prospect of, I don't know, winning in Wales like the SNP have done in Scotland over the past couple of elections?
Well, certainly, and in terms of what you were talking about earlier with independence, support for independence has increased dramatically over recent years because of how people can see how much we are mismanaged and misgoverned by successive Westminster governments. I mean, Plaid Cymru has put forward ambitious proposals to change how Wales is funded, to change that we have a fairer fact society.
The Barnett formula. You brought the Barnett formula into the election, and interesting thing about that is most independent analysis is that abolishing the Barnett formula does Wales quite well, and that you'd lose £1 billion according to the IFS. Why are you trying to abolish something that gives you more money?
Well, the IFS has actually conceded themselves that they're using figures that are 15 years out of date there, and that was before the effects of COVID, and our population is ageing more quickly than the rest of the UK. The Barnett formula, which is, by the way, devised in the 1970s, Lord Barnett himself conceded it was out of date. It can be manipulated. One of the best examples of this is HS2. You know, not an inch of track of HS2 comes within Wales, but because of some trick in the Treasury, it's been designated as an England and Wales project. So we in Wales have lost out on £4 billion as a result of this trickery. I mean, the Labour Party have conceded that this is a problem. By the way, all parties in the Senate, including the Tories, including Labour, have said that this is a problem, that we should be getting those billions back. It's only Plaid Cymru who are fighting to make sure that we actually get that money, because Plaid Cymru is the only party putting the interests of Wales front and centre at this election, and it's what we will continue to do.
Delis Jewell, Deputy Leader of Plaid, thank you very much for joining us. Right, let's change tack and think about how the parties think they will win the election, with billions of social media ads in the final days of the campaign. But what they're doing now on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, it's also quite instructive about their strategies. So let's get a little flavour of what's out there.
Dawn Butler and Nelson Production. Come on, 4th of July, don't forget to vote. We got 21 days to go. We got 21 days to go. If you like, let me know, let me out the shadow. Got 21 days, we gotta go. Wish you had D-Day, where did he go? Say wish you had D-Day, where did he go? Life don't let a liar run the show. Life don't let a liar run the show.
Guess who's back? Back again. Back again.
Hi TikTok, sorry to be breaking into your usual politics-free feed, but I'm making a big announcement today, and I've been told that a lot of you already have some views on it. So, first thing, no, I'm not sending everyone off to join the army.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
Now, we all know that too many tweets make you a, well, something or other. I'm not sure what too many TikToks make. Only Rishi Sunak won't put our hard-earned economic stability at risk. He'll restore pride and confidence in our country. And with a clear plan and bold action, we'll deliver a secure future for you.
Well, I don't know about you, I'm wondering what else is out there. There was actual dancing here in the studio. I know it's Friday night, but it's a rare sight in the Newsnight towers. Let's bring in Sam Jeffers of Who Targets Me about the parties who are targeting you. What are you seeing, Sam, in your sort of trawl of this of these ads?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, you know, there's been a couple of phases, I suppose, of the campaign so far, certainly from the Conservatives. You know, I think, as you were saying in your earlier item, you know, I think Nigel Farage entering the campaign changed the pattern of their advertising quite dramatically. They were clearly trying to recruit reform supporters before Farage entered the race, and the moment that happened, the whole tone switched. I think we saw almost the first mention of this idea that if you voted for reform or for the Liberal Democrats, you'd be handing Labour a massive majority, and this kind of idea that, you know, essentially they were conceding the election. That first popped up on a Facebook ad. So, you know, I think you know, we've basically had two phases from them. We've also seen the Labour Party spending a really larger sum of money. I mean, they've certainly spent a lot of money on YouTube. They've spent a lot of money on Facebook. They've had a much more organised and well-orchestrated campaign than the Conservatives seem to have had. So it's been a pretty busy first 3 weeks of the campaign.
And can you discern something a bit more detailed about the strategies here? You know, from the amount, from the timing, from where they're targeting the ads?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you see, I mean, even tonight, for example, Labour launched 2 new Facebook ads, and if you watch them quite carefully, they seem, you know, directed at very sort of similar look and feel to them, but almost directed at different audiences. One of them talks about workers' rights and you know, ending 0 hours contracts, and feels very directed at that kind of like core Labour support. And the other version, which is, you know, uses the same music, lots of the same shots, is much more focused on economic stability, economic growth, new manufacturing, and therefore has this kind of wider, potentially more of a kind of swing voter audience and so on. So you can see how, you know, the parties can be quite sort of subtle in the way they do this stuff to try and reach different parts of the electorate.
And Labour got in before the change in the eligibility for the for funding, didn't they? They seem to be more organised in terms of their social media, the timing of their social media ads.
Yeah, so the Labour Party launched the campaign very quickly. I mean, again, you know, obviously the Tories had control of the timetable, but Labour seemed to be very well drilled for the start of it. They had, you know, hundreds, I think, of YouTube ads ready to go with candidate videos straight off the bat at the beginning of the campaign. They spent a lot of money on YouTube very quickly. Lots of their candidates had their Facebook ads ready to go, and so Labour was outspending. I think so far in the campaign, Labour's outspent the Conservatives 10-1 on YouTube. You know, and a lot of that spending has been on these kind of candidate ads.
And are you seeing any pattern, Sam, in the geography of this? So have they changed the sorts of target seats? Can you discern anything from that sort of data?
Yeah, I think interestingly, the geography hasn't really emerged so far, at least from the 2 main parties. So lots of the Conservative ads are very much sort of nationwide that we can see so far, right. Particularly on YouTube. They're just essentially targeting all of England and Wales with the ads they've been running. Right. Labour is more geographically focused, but it hasn't really settled down into a pattern of exactly which seats. I mean, one of the theories we have looking at the data is that the actual number of seats they're targeting has slightly expanded over the last couple of weeks, which suggests maybe some confidence on their part. When we look down the kind of list of seats in which money is being spent, we essentially see that they're all Labour seats. I mean, I think we looked at the top 100 seats that we looked at in terms of spending. Labour was the top spender in about 98 of them. So, you know, they're really pushing much harder than Conservatives all over the country.
And you were making a very interesting point, which we can't get into now, about how some of the antics we see, shall we say, on the campaign trail, that really works on social media because it gets you free engagement and without having to pay for it, which is an important point. Listen, thanks very much, Sam Jeffers there from Who Targets Me. We'll be following some of your data. Let's spin that back at some on the panel. Kirsty, have you seen many of these targeted ads? Who's targeting you?
I've seen a few. Weirdly, I'm getting geo-targeted almost immediately by my Labour candidate, who isn't my Labour candidate, by the way. I'm a street over from where they think the so I'm incorrectly geo-targeted. But
only just.
But what is interesting is I can't move on my timeline for Instagram without lovely Becky Cooper popping up and saying, hello, I'm from Labour. I've had one leaflet from the Conservatives through my door. And the big reason for this is money. The donors have dried up for the Conservatives. So whilst obviously the rules changed and you can spend more money on social media advertising, actually, and I don't know if you remember, there was a row with the smaller parties saying it disproportionately favours, you know, the Conservatives and Labour. Well, actually, it's turned out it only really favours Labour because the donors have dried up and Tories don't have the money to support the social media targeting.
Quite profound. So the Tory campaign is physically constrained.
Yes,
how many ads we're seeing.
I've had ministers complain to me that, you know, Rishi Sunak supported the change in the spending rules to allow for more social media spending, and actually now it's hitting them really hard because Labour are massively outspending them on social media.
Very interesting. Rachel, in terms of the geography of where you target the ads, I mean, are we seeing this physically as well? Has there been a shift in the geography of where Labour is targeting during the course of this campaign?
Well, I think one of the ways that Labour has managed to get the geographic advantage from the get-go is they had their candidates selected beforehand. Their candidates, for the most part, had their videos ready beforehand. So even though the timing of the election was a surprise, and that was an advantage that the government had in deciding when they were going to call that election, it does seem that it was the Conservatives who were caught off guard, because Labour candidates came out with their videos within hours of that announcement being made. Keir Starmer came out with his campaign video before, almost within, while Rishi Sunak was still speaking in the rain on the steps of Number 10. So they were clearly ready for this, and that means that they have an advantage when it comes to recognition. I was speaking to a Labour candidate earlier this week who said in the constituency that she is canvassing, local people know her. She went and got her hair done, and someone said, "I've recognised you. I've seen your Facebook videos."
From the ads?
Yes, I've seen from the ads. So just getting in there early has proved a massive advantage.
OK, let's bring in Nick. I mean, you've got lots to say about this, but I think we want to talk about the latest news on the honours list.
That's right. So it is Sir Alan Bates. So in the last half hour, we have learnt the birthday honours, the King's birthday honours that are released ahead of Trooping the Colour tomorrow. And the former sub-postmaster and the campaigner, Sir Alan Bates now, who is obviously the key character in the ITV drama, has been knighted. It's interesting. Sir Alan tells PA News that he found out about this when he was listening to Paula Venables give evidence to the Post Office inquiry. And the interesting wrinkle there is that he had previously been offered an OBE, said no because Paula Venables had a CBE. Paula Venables returned that, and that clearly meant that he felt that it was right for him to get this. But the key point he says is this is for all the people that he's campaigning on behalf, and he still has a long way to go, he says, with his campaign.
They should put him in the House of Lords. Wouldn't he be an effective legislator there?
Well, if there's much left of the Lords, depending on what the election result is. Anyway, we must leave that there. Thank you, Nick, and thank you to Rachel and to Kirsty. That's nearly it for the week. But before we go, we know there was a big football match tonight, and although it wasn't the result Scotland fans were hoping for, we have a message to you from one of your own, our Kirsty, who was in Munich with the Tartan Army. Good night.
OK, it wasn't a triumph. Scotland didn't even play very well. We've got a single goal, and it's not over till it's over. 2 more games, Switzerland and Hungary. You don't support Scotland for the glory. You support it for the ups and the downs.